We are at the back end of a 48-hour surcease between Super Sunday and Super Tuesday, and within 4 or 5 hours we will know the results, and I hope they are as gratifying to each of you as the result in Arizona was on Sunday afternoon. I'm fighting a bit of a February cold, and I hope you will make allowance for that this evening. I would like to say, first of all, I am especially grateful to Roger Hertog and the board and to Louise Mirror for the opportunity to present these lectures, and I am especially grateful to the man in whose name and honor these lectures have been prepared, Dick Gilder, who with Lewis and others has inspired and sustained with passion and generosity the urgent mission of placing the study of history at the direct service of the public weal, illuminating our past so that we may more successfully make sense of a crowding present. There is no truism that is more homely than this, and yet none is uttered with less conviction by a generation of academic historians who pursue history, most of them, for the satisfaction they derive, as Arthur Schlesinger once wrote, from a disciplined attempt to reconstruct the past, or in the words of a great French historian, for the joy we find simply in learning singular things. For public persons, people who contribute to the public weal and are influenced by it, however gratifying, these reasons are not enough. We need to learn from a purpose, and a constant purpose from the past. I am troubled by the remoteness of the American military establishment from the nation it represents and whose interests its government calls upon it to advance. I will be talking in these lectures about 3 Republican generals, Republican of course with a small r, 3 soldiers, each of whom commanded the American Army in the most consequential war of his time and century, George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and George C. Marshall, each of whom was a careful student of the nature of an army appropriate to our country. In the case of Washington, to the colonies whose militia and continental forces represented their necessary and often begrudged contribution to a common military instrument. I will be talking about the character and genius of each man, genius on this wise meaning a profound aptness for the duties he was given to discharge. I will be considering our country's profound ambivalence through our history towards the character and sometimes even the necessity of a military establishment. 2 final points by way of preface. When I say the remoteness of the American military establishment in 2008, I mean its distance, its lack of plangency from and to most of us. Since January 1st, 1973, recruits to our country's armed forces have comprised volunteers only. None of our children is obliged to serve. Few of the ancient famous universities for which our children and grandchildren seek to strengthen their claims on admission, few of them even retain detachments of the Reserve Officers Training Corps or greet a senior's announcement that he will accept a commission in the Marines with anything less than stupefaction. We admire what we know and see of the quality of our soldiers' service, of their bravery and patriotism. Again, however, our admiration, unqualified, is called forth only when some headline reminds us to acknowledge it. Lord Macaulay wrote that he proposed to write the history of his country from the earliest times down to a date within the memory of men still living. The last of these military leaders whom we will consider died in October 1959, but hundreds of thousands of those whom he led are still, all in their 80s and 90s, still living. The memory of their service in the Second World War is vivid and fresh, and close to it in many ways For so many of them, it is a cherished memory of the kind that continually influences what they think when they think about the military and their own service in it. One of their generals in World War II, one of the two most senior American officers killed in the war, was the son of an important Civil War general. Not the grandson or great-grandson, but the son. Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., killed on Okinawa in 1945, son of the man who surrendered Fort Donelson, Kentucky to Ulysses Grant in 1862. The generation of Marshall, of MacArthur, of Franklin Roosevelt, all born within 2 years of each other, 1880, was a generation taught by men who were still young and who had fought under Sherman and Grant or Lee and Jackson. That is how close in time we were to that generation. Men stood uncovered in April 1945 at the little train station in Garrison, New York, as the train bearing the body of Franklin Roosevelt made its way north to Hyde Park, exactly where 80 years earlier their fathers had stood as Lincoln's train also slowed on its way to Illinois. In their turn, Lee and his contemporaries were children or close to it of the Revolution. Lee, of course, the son of a hero of that war. The tight linkages among these generations, as we will see, are important to our understanding of American military leadership, of military strategy, and especially of the nature and role of an army in a democratic republic. No public ambivalence has been greater in our history than our attitude towards American arms, the need or absence of an army, whether it must be large or small, whether it must comprise professionals or citizen soldiers, volunteers or conscripts. On the one hand, there is the counsel of George Washington, famous counsel adapted from the ancients, that reflects profoundly his own service as well as his study. Si vis pacem para bellum, if you wish for peace, prepare for war. On the other hand, and here is a choice illustration, that of William Jennings Bryan, Woodrow Wilson's first Secretary of State, quote, should the need arise and the call go out, 1 million Americans will spring to arms overnight. This ambivalence is reflected in many ways, several of them of profound consequence. The country's astounding unpreparedness for war in 1898, in 1917, in 1940, 41, and 1950. In each case, victory, or in the case of Korea, an outcome acceptable to the administration, was attained. And yet each was followed by a time of, take your pick, retrenchment, a peace dividend, the end of the draft, a profound shrinkage of our military establishment. George Marshall in April 1947 flew to Moscow for a foreign ministers conference, representatives of France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. He opened a letter on the plane which had been put in his hand before he left Washington, and it said, "Give the Russians hell." Marshall told his biographer several years later, quote, "My capacity for giving hell, and I know something about how to give hell, at that time consisted of 1 1/3 divisions. The Soviets had 185, 20 months after the end of the war." Each of these periods was followed by serious public debate and debate within the Army. Who should serve? Is there a need for such service? Who should be chosen? Washington famously wrote, "It may be laid down as a primary position and the basis of our system, that every citizen who enjoys the protection of a free government owes not only a proportion of his property, but even of his personal services in the defense of it," unquote. In 17th century Maryland, the elective franchise was not awarded to those who were not or had not been members of the militia. And a hearty